Together, you heard talk of a post-war slump in case of disarmament. In Europe, what stood out above all was the stark gap between our plenty and the misery of victor and vanquished alike. We were unscathed by the war, but there people starved and froze in the rubble. Some of our leaders had grim memories of another post-war period when a young Hitler built towers of madness out of Europe's ashes. So let's help Europe back on its feet, they said. But a nation weary of entangling commitments and rushing pell-mell to gratify desires long deferred wasn't so sure. However, another victorious ally had plans of its own, ambitions that seemed to betray our wartime friendship. Here's how a 1947 film described it.
Gone was the spirit of wartime unity that reached its peak on that historic afternoon in April '45 at the Elbe River in Germany. Here, two worlds actually met, but this coalition was to be torn asunder. 2 years later, European capitals still suffering from the shooting war were battlegrounds for totalitarian aggression. Internal recovery was sabotaged through the creation of disaster and strife to the point of civil war. Russia's expansionism timetable called for dividing Europe in two, swallowing first one half, then the other. Already an iron curtain had dropped around Poland, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Bulgaria.
So the world was to be divided again into hostile forces, us and them. And what did we know about them? Not much. Since the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, we'd been of divided mind about the USSR. Was it a contagious plague breeding world revolution? Or just another great power in red clothing? Never mind. Necessity had allied us with the Russians in the struggle against Hitler. Our own propaganda had encouraged us to see them as stalwart comrades, whose casualties in that struggle numbered 20 million people or more. Now events required that we take a closer look. The diplomat George Kennan, who had served in Moscow, would warn us the Russians were insecure, even neurotic, and impervious to the logic of reason. He said their ambition would fill every nook and cranny where it was unopposed. As indeed it seemed to do. One after another, communist regimes were imposed on Eastern Europe, until finally in 1948, there occurred the emotional trigger that snapped us wholeheartedly into Cold War. The place was hard to spell, but impossible to forget. Czechoslovakia. We remember that 10 years earlier, Czechoslovakia had been offered up to Hitler as an appeasement by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. A democracy sacrificed to preserve peace in our time. In 1948, Czechoslovakia, although allied by treaty with Russia, was again free and democratic. Its leader, the popular Jan Masaryk, a friend of the West. But in February, communists seized control. The world was told that Masaryk would be allowed to stay in office. A few days later, the government officially announced that he had committed suicide by throwing himself out the window. The American public was outraged. What economic and humane appeals had failed to do, spreading communist influence now achieved. Congress approved billions of dollars for massive economic assistance to Europe, the Marshall Plan. Hardly had Congress acted than the Soviets forced confrontation in Berlin, the exposed nerve of the Cold War. Occupied Germany was governed in 4 zones, the British, French, American, and Russian sectors. The former capital, Berlin, also in 4 zones, lay entirely within the Soviet sphere. In June of '48, the Russians imposed a blockade on Berlin, shutting off truck and train travel to the western zone. The only routes left open were air corridors. The United States faced desperate choices: force the road open and risk all-out war, or leave Berlin to fall like Czechoslovakia. But our generals proposed an absurd solution: supply Berlin's 2 million people completely by air, flying everything, from potatoes to coal. A crazy idea indeed, but somehow fitted for a topsy-turvy world. U.S. planes flew 4,500 tons of supplies a day in over 250,000 flights to people who only a few years earlier were Hitler's loyal folk. It worked. This mini Marshall Plan in the skies, it worked. In May of 1949, the outmaneuvered Russians called off the blockade. No European country has gone communist since. President Harry S. Truman had drawn the line in Europe. The United States had been willing to share its economic power with the Europeans. And as a military power, we could rest secure because the atom bomb, the super weapon that had ended World War II, was an American invention and an American monopoly. The monopoly ended September 2nd, 1949, 4 years and 1 month after Hiroshima. It was officially confirmed by the end of the month. The Russians had exploded their own A-bomb. So incredibly, just 4 years after the end of the war, the world was full of new dangers. Of course, we'd been told that ever since 1946, when Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain. The glow of wartime warmth toward our Soviet ally faded fast. We were sold the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan with the argument that without them, Soviet troops might march through all of Europe, even though we had a monopoly on the bomb and Russia was still a war-ravaged land with more reason to worry than we. Stalin fed our phobias by rejecting our offer of economic help as financial aggression, by quickly condemning the idea for mutual control of the atom, by making Eastern Europe a communist prison camp. Now, in 1949, all of China fell to the communist forces of Mao Zedong. We saw red almost everywhere. And the Russians, the technologically backward, primitive Russians, got the bomb. We leaped from what we knew to what we dreaded to think. Somehow, somewhere, possibly right here at home, we were being betrayed. Insistent questions resounded in Washington. Who helped the Russians gain the secret of the A-bomb? Who lost China to the communists? Suspicions fell on fertile ground. There had been concern about communist spies even before the war. Now we learned in 1946 of a big Soviet espionage ring in Canada with possible links in the U.S. So Washington launched a wide hunt for security risks in government. The litany of people attesting to their loyalty became as familiar as once had been the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I am not and never have been a communist. I am not and never have been a fellow traveler. I am not and never have been a supporter of, a member of, or a sympathizer with any organization known to me to be or suspected by me of being controlled or dominated by communists.
Not only bureaucrats had to stand the test, so did movie stars. Some were glad to do it, even eager.
I have seen things that I thought were against what I consider good Americanism, in my feeling, and I have seen it I've seen pictures I thought shouldn't have been made. Shouldn't have been made, let me put it that way.
Why Hollywood? Because the Communist Party in America had indeed seen in movies a glamorous way to promote political ideas. During the war, it had been patriotic to make movies extolling our ally, Russia. No more. With Moscow now our nemesis, anti-communist congressmen found that red hunting in movie land guaranteed them Klieg-like publicity.
I personally, with all due regard to Mr. Hoover, whose opinion I respect most highly, certainly do believe that the Communist Party should be outlawed. However, I'm not an expert on politics or of what the reaction would be. If I had my way about it, they'd all be sent back to Russia or some other unpleasant place.
The applause soon grew to hysteria. Large numbers of Americans decided the Red Menace had to be rooted out. If you were accused and refused to cooperate or insisted on your right to remain silent, you could find yourself unemployed or blacklisted and unemployable. The issue had become black or white. Were you with us or with them? Who did lose China? Who gave away those atomic secrets? Who indeed is un-American? Why, anybody might be, was the answer. Spies, subversives, and fellow travelers seemed to look just like anyone else, or better than anyone else, like Alger Hiss, former government official, president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, now accused of having been a communist. His accuser, Whittaker Chambers, asserted that it was difficult to sort out those who were spies.
Mr. Hiss represents the concealed enemy against which we are all fighting, and I am fighting.
The conclusion was inescapable. The person next door, down the street, on the bus, could be a spy, or in sympathy with the enemy and thus capable of springing forth full-blown to betray America if given the chance. And that made it difficult to tell who was them and who was us. The conclusion, in a nation cradled by the Bill of Rights, was frightening, and people began to behave in frightened ways. Films and dramas reflected fear that the enemy was coming, if not by conquering arms, then by infiltrating ideology. In one movie, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, an entire community is converted into aliens one by one.
Эти американские папиросы, они очень хорошие.
Speak English, comrade. Remember, that is about the only freedom you do not have in this town. This American town.
Americans, they have too many freedoms.
That is another thing you must remember, comrade. For one day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Another film called Red Nightmare presents a town so transformed in a dream that a man is confronted by his entire family, small children included, who are suddenly fervent communists.
Hey, what is this? Someone going on a trip?
You could call it a trip. Actually, the children are going away to a state school.
Now, wait a minute. Wait just a minute. I don't know what's happened to you or what they've done to change you, but you're not going to send these kids away.
Oh, she's not sending us away. It was our idea. We learned in school that home life does not encourage the growth of the collective character which the party wishes to develop in its young people. It's your fault. You should have spent more time training us to think along party lines. As a member of the Young Pioneers, it will be my duty to report you.
You better listen to me, all of you. I don't want to hear any more talk about state schools and party lines and collective character and deviationism. This is going to be a family again, and I know just where to start. You two are going to Sunday school, and you're going right now.
It was but a short route from the fear of being taken over to the fear of those who were different, to the fear of being different yourself. Conformity became the best defense, a refuge of smooth similarity. I Am an American Day and Loyalty Day became the high holy days of this anxious time. And at the head of the parade appeared this man, Joseph R. McCarthy, the junior senator from Wisconsin. Looking for an issue that would get him reelected, he seized on the fears of millions and launched the squalid campaign that became known as McCarthyism. Its tactic, reckless and undocumented accusations against government employees.
Mr. Chairman, today this man, John S. Service, is a ranking officer in the policy-making group of untouchables on duty in Calcutta, India, one of the most strategically important listening posts in the world today. He was not an acceptable risk under Mr. Atchison's own yardstick of loyalty the day he entered the government.
Intimidation bred audacity, and audacity fed upon itself. McCarthy soon had the celebrity he sought. The stage was his alone to command.
You're not fooling anyone. I have offered to go before any committee, do anything you ask. If I can just get you to come down here and take the oath so we can get the answers to some questions. You're not fooling anyone at all. I'm sure of that.
Some victims understood his methods well enough.
The technique used by the senator in making these charges is apparently typical. He first announced at a press conference that he had discovered the top Russian espionage agent in the United States. At this time, he withheld my name. But later, after the drama of his announcement was intensified by delay, he whispered my name to a group of newspaper men with full knowledge that it would be bandied about by rumor and gossip and eventually published. I say to you that this was unworthy of a senator or an American.
But with his innuendos and lies and bully boy deceits, Joseph McCarthy pushed the boundaries of fair play too far and was finally destroyed by his own excess.
At this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
The Senate and the national audience had also had their fill. Within months, McCarthy was formally censured by his colleagues. His 4 years of influence were over. How had this inquisition gone on for so long? Why didn't more people stand up sooner? Well, after 4 years of total war against fascism, we found it hard to come down from the patriotic high of a righteous cause. We saw communist police states that reminded us of the ugly totalitarian powers of the 30s, and real communist spies turned up among our allies. Our leaders made the most of these combustible materials. To embolden us for our New World role, they created an official case of the jitters from just about every quarter, from churches, industrialists, unions, schools, the press, and the military. We were bombarded with a hate the enemy campaign rare for peacetime. The Attorney General's list of subversive organizations made it open season on scapegoats. And the fear got out of control. It created an irrational craving for the safety of conformity, a stampede of patriotic fervor. A lot of things got trampled: careers, lives, good judgment. It became easy to win votes with charges of conspiracy and hard to fight back, especially when the air was thick with suspicion. Things weren't going in the world the way we wanted them to go. We couldn't even win a little war in Korea. It wasn't supposed to be called a war. The proper name was the United Nations Police Action. Tell that to the men who fought there, most of them Americans. Communist North Korea started it, pouring troops into South Korea in June of 1950 and raising fears in Washington that a Russian-Chinese axis was trying to repeat in Asia what Moscow had accomplished in Eastern Europe. The South Koreans were quickly backed into a corner of their peninsula and on the verge of defeat when the Americans arrived under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Only a fluke got Americans there at all. Russia was in the midst of a tantrum at the United Nations and boycotted the very session where the vote was taken to send a mutual security force to help South Korea. So the Russians lost the chance to veto the decision, and Harry Truman was able to dispatch American troops under the UN umbrella without even consulting Congress. There wasn't at first much opposition at home. Most of us thought the line had to be drawn in Asia as it had been drawn in Europe, or else the communists would keep testing their luck. At first, all went well. MacArthur launched a brilliant amphibious attack behind the North Korean border, cutting the communist forces in half and taking almost all of North Korea. So much of it, in fact, that UN units were able to approach the border between Korea and Communist China. There were warning signals from the Chinese, signals that were ignored. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops hurdled the border and came slashing down on the Americans. Now, we were trapped, and our troops had to fight their way out in the bitterest of winter cold to be evacuated back to South Korea. With the snow, melted hopes of quick victory. This was the second war in 5 years for some of these men. They were sick of violence, mud, and GI rations, sick of being away from home. Their folks back home lost enthusiasm too. All those cries in 45 of peace, peace, and where was it? There wasn't even victory, just stalemate. When it was all over, the truce line was very near the original borders violated by the communists in 1950. Douglas MacArthur hadn't wanted it to end that way. Let's renew the offensive and take on China if need be, he said. His superiors feared this would set off a Third World War, and when MacArthur persisted, Harry Truman fired him. MacArthur came home from the Army to a hero's welcome. There was talk of running him for president. He fancied the idea, but it never bloomed, and he faded away. There would be a general in the White House, all right, but one less given to military flourish. At heart, a civilian like us. The campaign button said it all. We did like Ike, and small wonder. Soldier, statesman, liberator of Europe. Born in a small Kansas town, not in a log cabin, but close enough to it so that, shucks, came easily for him. Now the president of Columbia University, and everyone's prize catch, Democrat or Republican. The Republicans got him. He was a military man, so the Russians couldn't fool him. He was middle of the road, as were the majority of Americans. And he was friendly to business. That's what most voters wanted. Weary of too much politics and all those foreign crises, they wanted someone trustworthy to tend the store while we got on with the business of getting ahead.